back to Odylia Therapeutics Bridge Solutions video series. My name is Catherine Postamont, and today I want to present you with part one of an interview I did on scientific advisory boards for patient advocacy groups. For this interview, I spoke with Odylia's CEO and CSO, Ashley Winslow, and Odylia's Manager of Operations and Program Management, Jenny Klein. So without further ado, here's part one of that interview. Okay, welcome. So today I am interviewing two members of the Odylia team on scientific advisory boards for patient advocacy groups. So today we have Ashley Winslow, who is Odylia's CEO and CSO, and we have Jenny Klein, who is Odylia's Manager of Operations and Program Management. So I'll toss it over to them to kind of introduce themselves and their perspective on scientific advisory boards, their history of interaction with scientific advisory boards, and then we'll get into some questions. Ashley, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. So hi, everyone. Glad you could join us for this discussion today. A little bit about my background. I have a PhD in medical genetics. I've spent time in academic research, spent time in pharma research and drug development, and a lot of time and a lot of my recent history in the nonprofit sector, working in between patient groups, industry, as well as academic research. And so it's a lot of the what brings kind of my mindset to the table is that interaction between different groups in the drug development space to advance rare therapeutics for rare diseases. So with that, a little bit about my experience with scientific advisory boards. I have assembled and helped assemble scientific advisory boards within the academic space for therapeutics and development. I've also done the same within the industry space for drugs and development, not in the gene therapy space specifically. And then I sit on a number of scientific advisory boards for rare disease patient groups. Jenny?
Hey there, it's good to see everyone. I bring a little bit of a unique background and perspective. So I have a master's degree in physiology and a background in drug development, but I am also a rare disease patient and rare disease patient advocate. So I've had a lot of experience sitting on scientific advisory boards and assembling professional advisory boards within the nonprofit space for rare disease patient groups that like to fund research and translate research. So that's a little bit of my background and where I come from.
Great, thanks, Jenny and Ashley. So maybe I'll start with Jenny, and I'll say, as a patient advocacy organization, when is it best to form a scientific advisory board?
So I'll say this question really depends on the goal of the organization. So if you're an organization that raises money for research and awards grants, then I would encourage you to have a scientific advisory board to review grant proposals. That would be really important. Another important time to form a scientific advisory board would be if you are trying to translate or develop your own therapies as a rare disease patient group. A scientific advisory board would be incredibly important to help guide your research efforts, analyze results, make suggestions on how to move forward with your data, et cetera. So those are two really important times.
And how do you approach researchers about joining a scientific advisory board?
So I'm happy to jump in here. I think with a lot of the patient groups that we work with through Bridge Solutions, what we've seen, the initial kind of entry point to working with scientific advisors are the clinicians that were part of their diagnostic journey, either them as a patient or maybe their family member. And so there's an easy kind of segue into that conversation through familiarity. And I think some of those individuals are great to sit on scientific advisory boards, but over time, sometimes the need of the organization outgrows that more familiar relationship. And so that's a point where we would encourage groups to kind of take a step back and look at the broader research field, maybe published literature, or those who are writing articles within the space to try to identify the experts in that disease or related diseases. Or maybe it's if you have a therapeutic modality, gene therapy or small molecule or some antibody that is a good fit, maybe it's about finding an expert in that space. And so I think once get to a place where the organization kind of needs to branch outside of familiar relationships, it's good to start by writing those individuals an email. I think what I've heard from some patient groups is they've had the fortunate ability to attend conferences, and they can reach out to the individual and meet in person. That's not always easy because sometimes these people live very far away. But I think starting with an email and just explaining your background, your journey as a patient or with your family member, and what you're looking for, an email can start off that conversation, and then gauging their interest and seeing about following up over a Zoom or a FaceTime, depending on how people communicate easiest. Starting that next one remotely still is a very normal process. And I think if you don't get a response right away to the email, reaching out through maybe another clinician or another researcher or somebody who might be passionate about your cause but has a more direct connection, sometimes going through that individual can help as well.
I see. So maybe even using some of the scientific advisory board members you might have to get access to additional ones. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Do you have in your mind like an ideal number of people that a scientific advisory board should include?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think it's a good rule of thumb to have odd numbers, so a minimum of 5. If your organization is a bit bigger, I would say anywhere from like 5 to 21 individuals would be appropriate.
Yeah, and I think definitely going to the higher number, once you get past about 7, 9, 11 individuals, it can get hard to, I think, wrangle everybody. Also, scheduling can become a bear. So I think I've seen organizations that can effectively navigate having more individuals. I think for younger organizations, starting out small, or maybe tiering participation. So maybe you have some real decision makers in your voting board. But if you have other individuals that can't make every meeting, but you want to hear that voice and involve them and they want to be involved, maybe they're participatory, but it's, you don't have to hinge decisions on their availability. So just, I think sizing the board to your needs and also how agile you have to be, and how effective the group is at kind of being corralled and wrangled, because that's part of it. Jenny knows that well as a project manager. Keeping that in consideration is really important so you're an effective organization.
And you're saying an odd number so that if there's a vote, it doesn't come down to 50-50. There's always that one person who can make that decision. And then sort of going off of that, how do you decide how often a SAB should meet? Like you said, they can be from all over the country, all over different countries. How often do you think it's best to meet, and how do you think those meetings should take place?
Yeah, I think it's best practice to meet at a minimum of 2 times a year. Again, it really depends on the goals of your organization and what you have going on. Sometimes even with scientific advisory boards, you'll have working groups and working committees throughout the year. A good example of this would be if you're awarding grants and have a specific grant cycle where you need to review research proposals, you'll definitely have a scientific advisory board meeting more frequently. And meeting over, Zoom or any kind of other platform is okay. You don't necessarily have to meet in person every single year or every single time, but I think you do need to meet 2 to 4 times a year. I think that's really good practice.
Yeah, and Jenny, what are your thoughts on, just the cost of travel? Because it's, in my experience, when you're working with patient groups, and as a nonprofit ourselves, as Odylia, we're very mindful of how we spend money. So I think trying to not pay for others' travel to meet in person, I think especially since COVID is totally fine. A lot of people are used to that in my experience.
Yeah, no, I think that, meeting remotely is perfectly okay because travel is a big expense, especially as you have larger scientific advisory boards. However, if there's a conference that everyone likes to attend or goes to frequently, that might be a good meetup spot throughout the year. So there might be a couple of conferences a year where most of your scientific advisory board attends. So that would be an opportunity to meet in person.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Mhm. And do you guys have a feeling on why sometimes it can be really hard to recruit a great scientific advisory board? Why sometimes people are reluctant on joining a scientific advisory board?
I would, in my experience, I would say, at least in the rare disease space, people are very, I think scientists, even industry folks, are very willing to get involved. So I wouldn't say there's a reluctance necessarily. And maybe that's more specific to the rare disease space, because I think there's a big need that people recognize. But I think some of the just practical difficulties, time, making sure you have the appropriate time as a SAB member to commit to the organization, that can be tough. And that's an ever shifting landscape. You start out one year and time works out well, but then you take on more responsibilities and that might change the next year. But I think making sure as a SAB member and as the organizer from the patient group of that SAB, making sure you have an open line of communication. So as those things change, people feel included, but also feel like that's okay. And there's an understanding. Again, going back to the point before, I think having an effective SAB that can work remotely and proactively really does help, because not everybody can travel. And also when you work in the rare disease space, a lot of the patients and families have restrictions on how much they can travel. And you do want that interaction. It's important. But also the SAB over time will change and evolve. It should, as the organization changes and matures and the needs shift. And that's a dynamic process that it's time consuming to evaluate that and to reorganize it as needed. What about you, Jenny? What are other things that I'm missing?
I think it might also be difficult to recruit specifically for rare disease scientific advisory boards, because you need to recruit individuals with the right kind of expertise. And a lot of times in rare disease, it's hard to find those individuals, or maybe there's one individual that is very sought after. And that one individual can't necessarily sit on every single scientific advisory board that they're recruited for.
Great. Well, thank you guys, both of you. I think we might pause here for a bit and then come back to the discussion as a part 2 of our video series. So thank you again for this discussion, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of our video on scientific advisory boards for patient advocacy groups. Please feel free to like and subscribe to this video so you can get access to all of our videos as soon as they become available. And please comment and ask questions down below. We'd love to hear feedback. We look forward to seeing you soon for our part 2 of scientific advisory boards for patient advocacy groups.